A research trip I did to Norway about a year ago, last September. And partially that was funded by the Sons of Norway. I got a community outreach grant to help with funding for that. I spent 2 weeks in Norway, a week in Oslo at the Norwegian Folk Museum, and then another week up in the Fjordlands visiting a couple different fjord history museums. So I'll touch on that. I'm going to drop my presentation. So as I mentioned, coopering is a trade, a skilled trade. It requires an apprenticeship, 5 to 7 years of training to learn the trade. I served my apprenticeship at Cologne Williamsburg, so I'm a historical cooper using traditional tools, hand tools, the same way it's been practiced for literally thousands of years. So not just in Norway, but throughout Europe, and when the Europeans came to North America, they brought that technology with them as well. So, and the Norwegian word for cooper is bøke, so which took me a while to really figure out how to pronounce that properly in Norwegian.
How do you pronounce it again?
Bøke. So that O, and I'm not sure what that symbol, that type of O is called in Norwegian, but it has kind of an O-U sound. Bøke, like a bøke. Bøke. Yeah, it took me a while to get it. But, so coopering, as I mentioned, this is actually a medieval print, medieval German drawing. And it's actually from a retirement community in Germany in the Middle Ages where retired or aging tradesmen would go and work in this retirement community and practice their trades. And it's obviously a cooper. And for coopering, most of the time it was the production of barrels. Buckets and tubs were important in a domestic setting, but barrels were your primary shipping containers for just about everything. So beer, wine, tobacco, to nowadays whiskey, bourbon, wine, but virtually everything was shipped in important barrels. But the anatomy of a cask, so anything that a cooper makes, it's a pretty unique type of woodworking. Very different than carpentry, very different than joinery, shipbuilding. There's literally dozens and dozens of different types of traditional trades of woodworking. And the cooper is fairly specialized. They're strictly making containers that are made up of these vertical wooden slats called staves. You're making a circular vessel, sometimes oval, but mostly circular. It's always conical. A barrel is always bigger in the middle and narrower at the both ends. And that's so you can take the hoops, you're actually assembling all these loose pieces, the staves, into a series of hoops, and you're driving the hoops, hammering the hoops down onto the belly of that barrel or onto the wider diameter of a conical shaped bucket or wash tub. So there's never glue used. It's strictly the woodworking ability of the cooper, fitting those pieces together with the conjunction of the hoops, the pressure from the hoops being hammered onto it that makes it watertight. So, of course, beer barrels and wine barrels and water buckets and dairy buckets are watertight, but some barrels like tobacco hogsheads and nail kegs don't have to be made watertight. They don't require it. But this is basically kind of the terminology of a cask. So in the lingo of the trade, these all mean particular terms, but to the layperson, it's kind of cryptic, almost like another language. Next slide. So this is I served my time at Cologne Williamsburg. I started working there in 2001 and served a 6-year apprenticeship, and I continued working there for about 15 years, and in front of the public, but also using strictly hand tools to produce a variety of cooperage needs that are used both at Cologne Williamsburg, and we made a lot of stuff for other museums as well. So this was my master, Jim Pettingale, and he came from a family of coopers from London. And he served his apprenticeship at a brewery in London back in the 1950s. The master cooper who taught him had served his apprenticeship at that same brewery back in the 1920s, and the master who taught him back in the 19th century. And the brewery, Whitbread's brewery, dated back all the way to the mid-18th century. So the skills, the hand skills, were passed down orally through the apprenticeship from master to apprentice, and I'm simply next in line. So this is a picture from Cologne Williamsburg back in the early 2000s, and that's a younger me, much younger, much less gray hair, and but without kids at that time either. So that's the main reason why. But next slide, please. There we go. Okay. So, so just an assortment of some of the other cooperage that you see. This is a print from a French encyclopedia from the mid-18th century, the Denis Diderot Encyclopedia. And there's an assortment of a variety of coopered vessels. Again, always made up of vertical wooden slats called staves and then held together by hoops. So occasionally you see oval containers. And then, of course, mostly barrels, but butter churns, fishing buoys, flasks, flagons, tankards, cans, salting tubs, all sorts of things like that. This is a print, an image from the 19th century that I actually found. It's of Norwegian coopers. I can't remember the name of the southern coastal town in Norway, and it might even be on here. The coopers, I can't remember that right there. But they're making barrels. They're repairing some casks, and you can see this cooper here is driving the wooden hoops down on the cask to hold it together. This cooper here is sitting on top of a draw bench, which I brought one with me to demonstrate a little bit later. And he's backing or using a draw knife to carve the staves to form the circular shape of each component, each piece. So I brought a joiner plane as well. This cooper is running the stave across the blade, in the plane right here, to joint the edges where the staves meet up perfectly to form a liquid plates. Next slide. And at Cologne and Winsburg, mostly we're focusing on the trades as they were practiced in the late 18th century during the American Revolution and around that time period. And in Virginia, mostly we focus on particular industries like tobacco production and shipping tobacco back to England. All the tobacco was grown and cured and then packed into large barrels called tobacco hogsheads. They were conveyed to the warehouses along the rivers in those large barrels, either by boat or by horse, or simply by rolling them by hand. On average, they weigh about 1,000 pounds, but they're still easy to move because you can simply tip them over and roll them. That's one of the main advantages to using barrels of shipping containers and why they lasted for literally centuries as shipping containers up until more recently. Thanks a lot. This is a great image that I found in Harper's magazine from this is 19th century, mid-19th century. And this is the interior shot of a tobacco warehouse in Richmond, Virginia, where they're prying apart. They're basically, the tobacco hogsheads have been delivered to the warehouse, and now the tobacco has to be inspected. And so you have enslaved people down here who have taken the hoops off of the barrels. The staves have fallen away, and you have a freestanding loaf of compressed, cured tobacco leaf that they're prying apart. And the inspectors are grading it and checking it for mold and dirt and rocks and other things that adulterations that shouldn't be in with the tobacco. And then would prize it back up or package it back up in the barrels, and then it would be shipped all over the world at this point. So, as I was working at Cologne Winsburg over the past 15 years, and I realized that cooperage, really, when I started doing research on cooperage, that it was actually incredibly difficult to find any information on the trade. There was no manuals on coopering. What I found, though, is that as I started looking at specific industries that would employ coopers to make the packaging, to ship their products to markets, to distant markets, that's where you started finding information on the cooperage trade. So looking at manuals on tobacco production from the 18th century, looking at the whaling industry up in New England, and finding lots and lots of information on coopers in the whaling industry and how coopers were vital to going out to sea and harpooning the whales, rendering out the oil, and then packaging that oil in casks. But all the industries that were shipping large quantities of goods, the sugar industry, the wine industry, the gunpowder industry, they all employed coopers. Molasses too? Yeah, absolutely. And in Norway, it's predominantly the fishing industry that used a lot of barrels for export, and cider. So here's a painting by Clifford Ashley. He's an early 20th century painter and illustrator who, this was one of the last whaling ships that went out from New Bedford, Massachusetts. But these are coopers that are repairing casks before they go out to sea. Next slide, please. And this is an image of, I found this extremely fascinating. This is an exclusive to the whaling industry. Barrels were packed very tightly down into the holds of ocean-going vessels, sailing vessels. And they were used as ballast to really weigh the ship down so it wouldn't end up tipping over and rolling around. So you need that extra weight down in the hold of an ocean-going vessel, and the barrels constitute that weight. But all barrels, not just whaling casks, were packed very tightly and very well organized into the ship. So in high seas, if the casks end up shifting or moving, they could damage the ship or hurt people in the ships as well. So I found this is a great diagram. So I started exploring, as I started exploring different industries that would employ cooperage, I also started looking at classical artwork. And the Dutch masters are absolutely fantastic for finding. And in a lot of these, you're looking at the individuals, but then you start looking in the background, you start mining, you start finding all of these images of coopers used in everyday life, all the time, for all kinds of purposes and uses. And so dairy buckets, barrels for wine, barrels for fish, whatever. Next slide, please. So and I have just so many of these images, both Norwegian and Dutch, and really all throughout Europe, throughout all the time periods. So again, in the dairy maids always using coopered vessels, staved vessels for milking the cow, cheese production and butter production, which cheese and butter were the two main ways of preserving milk for a longer period of time. Next slide. So fish market. This is a Dutch painting, 17th century. Next slide. So that eventually this brought me to. So has anyone been to Norway here?
Yeah.
Is this Norway? Does this look like Norway?
Well, certainly parts of it.
Looks like
Parts of it, a little bit,
like
yeah.
Wisconsin.
Yeah. Oh, again, next slide. Next slide.
Where's the snow?
Yeah.
Yeah.
For 2 weeks they had a summer.
So yeah, that's my son down there. We went to the Field of Dreams field as well.
Oh.
But now, so at one point I started doing searches for cooperage online through the interwebs, and I ended up being drawn to some coopered vessels that were highly decorated. And I'm like, where is this stuff coming from? I mean, these can't be. Anyway, it was in the Vesterheim Museum in Iowa, in Decorah, Iowa. If any of you have visited there, it's an incredible museum. Incredible museum. And they have an online database, and they don't post everything in their collection on their database, but they have some really spectacular things. And they have ongoing exhibits and traveling exhibits, and they really have a lot of community outreach. They have a craft school where they bring people in to teach the classes and to carving classes, blacksmithing classes, and it's all based on a lot of Norwegian skills. So leatherworking as well, so lots of stuff. But so I was drawn to Vesterheim, and they have a Norwegian festival every August. I think it's August, July. But I contacted the curator there, and I was asking her about the artifacts, and that kind of started my journey on Norwegian cooperage and Scandinavian cooperage in general, but Norwegian specifically. Next slide, please. But and they they also have an incredible research library too, and a lot of stuff. They told me about this Norwegian digital database for museums, and it's actually not supposed to be just for Norway, but also Sweden, Iceland. I think Denmark is in it too. But it's mostly the Norwegian museums that have access they post their collections online. They take photographs of all their objects, and a lot of if you're in the Rosemont, there's a lot of Rosemont objects on the collection. But it's difficult to navigate in English. You really have to understand Norwegian. So the Laura Ann Gilbertson, who's the primary curator at Vesterheim, was very helpful in telling me which search terms I needed to find. Staved or logging vessels. So if I looked up Cooper or barrels, or anything like that, I never found anything. I had like 3 entries. But if I put in the word logging, I would find 7,000 entries. And it's incredible how much stuff survives, how much wooden objects survive in Norwegian and Swedish cultures because of how far north they are, but also how culturally important these staved vessels and these wooden vessels, wooden structures were to their culture all the way through into the 19th century and 20th century.
That looks like it's painted with rosemary on it also.
Yeah. This bowl, this was my favorite object at Vesterheim because of the rosemary on it, and it's a little bowl, and it's a butter bowl. about that big. And the staves extend out and they're bent little feet right here. And that was my favorite piece, even though it's really kind of beat up and it's pretty old. But I ended up finding, just by happenstance, another bowl that looked almost exactly like that at a museum in another museum in Norway. And I contacted the curator there, and by communicating with her, we figured out who the maker and the artist was.
Oh my God.
And I'm trying to think of the region in southern Norway. If somebody said it, I would know, but I can't think of it right now. Next slide, please. So that's a close-up of it. And I just love, that term will come in. I love the primary colors with the black outlines. That's one of some of my favorite Rosemont. Next slide. This is a salt cellar. So there were lots of these. This one's at Vesterhavn, but there were lots of these in Norway as well. And this style of decoration is brandy, where they heat up a piece of iron, and probably just a piece of hoop iron off of an old barrel. But they scored it, or they filed it down to create this decorative burning pattern on the exterior of the vessels. You see a lot.
How big
of
is that?
Hmm?
How big is that?
About that big.
That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, and there's actually a hole up in here, so you could be hanging it on the wall probably when you're not using it, and then put it back down on the table when you were using it. Next slide. But and that vessel was kind of squarish too. And most often you have the greatest strength when you have circular containers with cooperage because of how it's held together. But occasionally you would see oval containers or square containers. So here's just an image of a screenshot from my computer of the Digitop Museum. That's the name of the digital database that's tied into all of the Norwegian museums and a little bit of Swedish museums, and I think even fewer Icelandic museums. And you can select the language that you want to search with. But if you search English, you find very little stuff that they don't have it labeled under a lot of English terms. But here, the laget is the term used to describe, it's the verb describing the production of making these kinds of staved vessels. And you can see I have more than 7,000 hits. And it's all staved containers. And what's really interesting, what I found interesting about Norway and this database and the fact that there's so many of these that survive, while everywhere else in the world, cooperage was pervasive. In North America, in continental Europe, there's so much cooperage in use throughout most of recorded history, but so little of it survives because of how it's used and how it's viewed as just mundane objects that are going to be used up. And so they wear out, and because they're organic material, they just rot away. So, but in Norway, because of the climate and because of how these are viewed culturally as family heirlooms, they're passed down from one generation to the next. So many of these survive. Next slide. Oh, that same slide with the Coopers. Go. So on that Digital Museum database, I found that image of the Coopers, and then there's also post 1850s. There's lots of photography of people doing usually just farming activities. These are basically all dairy maids, and they're cleaning their cooling tubs, their cream tubs, their dairy buckets, and there's lots and lots of images like this on that database. And it's really amazing. But you got to find the right terms to search to find that stuff. So I went over. It was to Norway. It was just over a year ago, and I spent 2 weeks there. And the funding came from Sons of Norway, but also the Mortis and Tenon magazine, which is a hand tool magazine for woodworkers based out of Maine. And they provided me funding to go there for a couple weeks. And I visited the Norsk Folk Museum in Oslo for 1 week, and that's just outside of Oslo. And spent a lot of time there researching coopered vessels. And they literally have, thousands of these things. And this is only one. I have dozens and dozens of photographs of this room, and this was just the dairy room of the cooperage. And it just went on and on and on and on and on. And you can see some of these are in various states of disrepair, they're falling apart, and that does happen with coopers, but some of them are incredibly stable. I brought one with me that I found in an antique store in Norway, and it's a tar bucket. It's right behind you. You can check that out later, but it's probably an 18th century, little tiny 18th century bucket that's been glued together by the use of the tar, that they use that tar as a poor man's paint to paint their boats, to paint their houses, and it still smells as fresh as it's was made just last week. So next slide, please. And I mentioned, one of the things that first struck me about Norwegian cooperage was how much it was decorated. And in a lot of English cooperage traditions, there's very little decoration on it. It's meant to be functional and not decorative. And that's true of a lot of things like their furniture, and especially by the 18th century and after, you see very little decoration on their objects, but wooden objects. But in Norway and Sweden and a lot of continental Europe, especially Eastern Europe, you see a lot of these decorations. And in Norwegian decoration, carved, burned, painted, it's very unique to Norway. It's incredibly striking. Norway is an incredibly skilled wood culture, and they're very proud of that. The Staved churches are and I wasn't interested in Staved churches at all before I went over there. And then and when you're just driving around, you see them. There's one. Oh, there's another one. And they're thousands of years old, or 1,000 years old, and they're just incredible monuments to woodworking. And I think these Cooper vessels are just as important as those Staved churches. Next slide, please. So this is a drinking vessel, and there's lots and lots of these too. And these were used as family heirlooms, but whenever there was a life events where, like a wedding. What's that?
250 drinkers.
Yeah. Yeah. And this was only about this big. You have bigger ones, but this is meant to be passed around, so it's filled up with a spirit of some kind, or a beer, or some kind of alcoholic beverage, and then you're drinking from it, and everybody shares. You drink a little bit and then pass it to the next person. What's that?
Home brew.
Yeah, a lot of home brew. Next slide, please. So I spent a week in Oslo, and then I rented a vehicle and I drove up to the Fjordlands and visited the Fjord Folk Museum and the Nordfjord Folk Museum. And driving, in Oslo and driving in that general vicinity, the landscape was interesting, but it wasn't as striking as I thought it was going to be. And I'm from Michigan, and I spent a lot of time up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan as a young kid, and it kind of looked similar to that northern climate. But then as I started driving up into the mountains of Norway, and then finally hit the tree line, and you hit this plateau on top of the mountains that have been ground flat by the glaciers, and there's no trees anywhere. It's just incredibly striking. And this is just one spot before I went into a tunnel that was like a 30-mile tunnel underneath the mountains to go to the Sogn Fjord. And there were sheep up in this mountain. I actually got out of the car, climbed up there, and went to check out that barn. But it was just incredibly striking landscape. And up on top of the mountain, driving across this flat landscape for another hour or so, eventually you come into these vast lake districts. Next slide. So at the Sognefjord Museum, again, it's more of those drinking vessels, and this has a lot more. It's not just cooper, but then there was clearly another tradesperson, a carver, who would carve these really elaborate decorations onto some of these vessels. And I was really impressed with this carving here is a relief carving that it's carved though to form kind of like a woven rope, or almost like braided straw plating. That's all carved in the vessels. Next slide. And again, at the Sognefjord Museum, it is an incredible folk museum, and they have permanent exhibits, traveling exhibits, and then their collections. The curator there, he just said, just go on back and just study whatever you want. Just take anything off the shelf and take it to your study room and just spend as much time as you want with the collections. It was absolutely incredible, and they got very little visitation at some of these museums. They had some groups coming in from different parts of Europe, but overall they had very little visitation. Next slide. Oh, in relationship to that, you mentioned that you have, I think in November, a presenter coming down from Northern Virginia who's going to talk about the storytelling, the symbols of Norway. She's probably going to talk about a lot of that symbolism on the drinking vessels. And some of the ideas behind that, and I didn't go into a lot of research on it, but I'm interested in it. It's hard to find good scholarship on it, what a lot of those symbols actually mean. And some thoughts are that they are hexes or protective symbols to protect the product that's inside of the tankards or the buckets from spoiling, going bad. So it's like a magical spell you're putting onto the vessel. That's what some of the curators mentioned to me. So these are some of the buildings that they preserved, and I believe some of these, a lot of these were 15th century, 14th century wooden vessels that they moved from various parts of the Somme Fjord to this location, to a centralized location. Next one. I was at the Somme Fjord Museum for just 3 days, and then I drove north to the Nord Fjord Folk Museum, which was a little bit smaller, and their collections were still really fantastic. And they had a few really interesting vessels that I wanted to study. Next slide, including that large canteen. So it was nothing. I mean, to find 17th century vessels. And that's the other thing about Norwegian vessels, staved vessels, is that often most of them were dated. They had the date scribed onto them with the initials of the maker or the owner of the vessel. And in most, when you find original cooperage here in the United States, you have very little information or graffiti that's been carved onto it. So it doesn't give you a lot of information about who made it. And so the makers' names are lost to history. But in Norway, there's a lot more pride taken in the production of the vessel. This symbol is known as a bowman's knot, and was also considered basically like a hex or a spell that we could put onto the container. And this kind of canteen was quite large, and it was generally used to transport milk or cream from up on top of the mountains during the summer months, when they would drive their livestock, cows, goats, sheep, up on top of the mountains for grazing. But then as they were grazing on the grasses and they're milking the cows, they're taking that dairy product and putting it in canteens like this, and then bringing it back down to the bottom of the fjords to sell it on the market. So they have these great big canteens for transporting. And this, while it looks like a drinking vessel, and it's not. It's actually a butter mold. So you place your butter into it, and it was about that big. Some of them were larger. And you'd fill it full of freshly made butter, and on the interior lid, and I wish I had gotten a shot of that, but the interior of this lid has a really intricate design carved into it, so that when you press that lid down onto the freshly made butter, it would form a mold or an imprint of that symbol onto the top of the butter. It was really incredible. And I have some images of it. I just don't think I put them in this slide presentation. So here's an image. I found there was this publication by this guy, Adolf Tiedemann, the Folklivsbilder, mid-19th century, and it has a lot of images of just Norwegian kind of folk life, and it's romanticized, but really, really interesting. And this is where, early summer, late spring, where they start transporting their livestock up on the top of the mountains of the fjords, because there's better grazing up there in the summer months. And they have the summer homes, and they have the winter homes, which are down near the water of the fjords. So, next slide. And here are it's usually the young ladies who would go up, and they would stay up on the top of the mountains and tend to the livestock. And a lot of the stories are that the young men were still down in the fjords doing farm work, but they'd sneak up at night to meet with the young ladies, but they weren't supposed to be doing that, of course. And there's some images portraying that too. It's really good. Next slide. And I started finding a lot of images from Norwegian artists from the 19th century and early 20th century, portraying really just folk life in a sense. So here they're washing their clothes, and it's the middle of winter, so they're breaking the ice open on the river and washing the clothes in an ice hole. And it's it's good. Oh, I skipped one, but I think that's another one. So this is another image from that book, and this is the fisheries. And the fisheries, the cod fisheries, were huge up in Norway, where they're salt curing the fish, they're catching the fish, gutting the fish, and then salt curing, using lye to cure the fish, and then packing it into barrels and then they're shipping that cod all over, really all over the world, but probably most of it down into southern Europe, that area. I think this might be my final slide, but another image of women doing laundry in a much more pleasant climate.
Yeah, we're still doing it.
Yeah, all by hand.
Yeah.
I believe that's it. So I want to invite you. I want to do a quick demonstration. We don't have a whole lot of time, but I brought some of my tools and some of the coopers that I made and some antique coopers. A couple pieces that I brought from Norway and some other pieces that aren't. Some from Finland, but some other antiques that I've collected over the years. So I'd like to invite you to come on over here.